I never thought a piece of paper could feel like a weapon. But the day I pulled my property deed out of a dusty folder in my closet, I realized that a single paragraph, written decades ago by a title company clerk, was about to become the most powerful thing I owned. This is the story of how a woman I'll call Deborah, the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association, tried to convince an entire neighborhood, and eventually a judge, that the private driveway easement running along the side of my house was somehow public property. She was loud. She was relentless. She had a laminated binder of HOA rules that she carried like scripture. And she was completely, catastrophically wrong. Let me back up and tell you how it started. The house with the extra line on the map. 3 years ago, my husband Mark and I bought a modest 2-story home on a quiet cul-de-sac in a mid-sized suburban development. It wasn't flashy. It had a decent yard, an attached garage, and, this is the important part, a narrow paved driveway that ran along the side of our lot, connecting our garage to the street. What made our driveway unusual was that it also served as access for our next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Walter, whose garage was tucked behind our property with no direct street frontage of his own. Decades earlier, when the neighborhood was first subdivided, the original developer had carved out a legal easement, a strip of our land that Walter, and only Walter, and future owners of his specific lot, had the right to use to reach his garage. This wasn't a mystery. It was written into both of our deeds in plain language. Our title company explained it to us during closing. Our real estate agent pointed it out on the survey. It was, frankly, one of the most boring and unremarkable facts about the house. An exclusive, a pertinent easement benefiting one specific neighboring parcel. Nothing more, nothing less. For the first year, it caused 0 problems. Walter was a kind, quiet man who used the driveway maybe twice a day, always waved when he passed, and once brought us a jar of homemade pickles as a thank you for keeping the pavement clear of snow. It was, honestly, kind of nice having a reason to know your neighbor. Then Walter's health declined, and he moved in with his daughter 2 states away. His house went up for sale. And that's when Deborah entered the picture. Enter Deborah. Deborah had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 20 years and had appointed herself president of the Homeowners Association through what I can only describe as sheer force of will. She wasn't elected so much as she was the only person willing to sit through 3-hour meetings about mailbox paint colors. Over time, she had built up a reputation. Some people respected her. Most people simply avoided conflict with her, because conflict with Deborah had a way of following you home. When Walter's house sold to a young couple, Deborah saw an opportunity. The new owners were unfamiliar with the neighborhood's quirks, and more importantly, they were unfamiliar with the specific legal language buried in their own deed. Deborah, meanwhile, had developed a theory, one she repeated with the confidence of someone who had never once opened a property record, that the shared driveway was actually a neighborhood access easement, open for use by anyone in the HOA who needed extra parking. I first heard about this theory secondhand, from another neighbor who mentioned that Deborah had told the new couple they were welcome to use the driveway easement for guest parking during the block party. I remember laughing it off. It seemed like a harmless misunderstanding. I figured a quick, polite conversation would clear it up. I was wrong. The first confrontation. The following Saturday, I came home from the grocery store to find 3 cars parked along our driveway, none of which belonged to Walter's old house, now the new couple's home. One was a minivan I didn't recognize. Another had an HOA parking pass hanging from the mirror, the same pass as Deborah handed out to residents for community events. I parked on the street, walked up, and found Deborah standing at the end of my driveway with a clipboard, directing cars like she was running valet service at a wedding. "Hi, Deborah," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "I think there's been a mix-up. This driveway is a private easement. It's only for the house behind us." She didn't even look up from her clipboard. "This is a shared community easement," she said. "It's been used for neighborhood access for years. I have it documented in the HOA handbook." "The HOA handbook isn't a legal document," I said. "This is on my deed. It's a private easement benefiting one specific property." She finally looked up, and I got my first real taste of what I'd later come to think of as the Deborah special. A tight, patient smile that somehow managed to be both condescending and aggressive at the same time. "Sweetheart," she said, "and I want you to imagine the exact tone that makes your blood pressure spike. I've been on this board for almost 2 decades. I think I know a public easement when I see one." I told her, calmly, that I would be happy to show her the deed. She waved a hand and said she didn't need to see paperwork, because she already knew the rules of the neighborhood. Then she turned back to directing the minivan into a tighter parking spot, 3 feet from my garage door. I stood there for a second, genuinely stunned. Not because she was wrong, people are wrong about property law all the time, but because of how absolutely certain she was, despite having zero legal basis for any of it. That night, I pulled out our closing documents for the first time since we'd bought the house. What the deed actually said. I want to walk you through this part carefully, because it matters, and because I think a lot of people don't realize how specific and precise these documents actually are. Our deed contained what's called an appurtenant easement. In plain English, that means the right to use a specific strip of land is legally attached to a specific neighboring property, not to the general public, not to the neighborhood as a whole, and not to the homeowners association. It travels with the land when it's sold, which is why it's still applied to the new owners of Walter's old house. But it does not expand. It does not become communal. It doesn't grow legs and wander over to benefit anyone else who feels like using it. The language was almost comically specific. It named the exact parcel that benefited from the easement by lot number. It described the exact width and length of the paved strip. It even specified that the easement was for ingress and egress purposes only, meaning driving through, not parking, not storing boats, not hosting block parties. I also found something else buried in our HOA's governing documents, the same documents Deborah claimed backed up her theory. I read every page. Twice. There was no mention, none, of any community access easement running through our property. The HOA handbook, the one she waved around like scripture, mostly covered things like fence height, holiday decoration limits, and trash can storage. It said nothing about driveways that weren't part of the association's common areas. Our driveway had never been common area. It was, and always had been, private land with one specific, narrow legal exception carved out of it. In other words, Deborah wasn't just wrong. She was inventing a rule that existed nowhere except in her own head, and then enforcing it with the confidence of federal law. Trying to do this the easy way. I want to be clear that I didn't go into this looking for a fight. I'm not a confrontational person by nature, and honestly, dealing with an HOA dispute was the last thing I wanted to spend my evenings on. So my first move was diplomacy. I printed a copy of the relevant page of our deed, the part with the legal description of the easement, and highlighted the language about the specific benefiting parcel. I put it in an envelope and left it politely in Deborah's mailbox with a short, friendly note asking her to please let the new neighbors know that the driveway wasn't available for general parking. 2 days later, I got a reply. Not a note. A formal letter, printed on HOA letterhead, informing me that my attempt to restrict community resources was a violation of neighborly conduct and that continued obstruction could result in a formal complaint to the board. I read that letter 3 times, trying to figure out how showing someone their own legal deed constituted obstruction. It didn't make sense until I realized Deborah wasn't actually engaging with the document at all. She'd decided what the truth was, and now she was simply defending that position, regardless of what evidence appeared. Over the next month, things got worse in small, irritating ways. Guest cars kept appearing in the driveway during HOA events. Once, someone left a folding table and chairs set up halfway across the pavement for a neighborhood yard sale, blocking our garage entirely for 6 hours. When I asked Mark if I was overreacting, he pointed out that we hadn't even done anything provocative. We'd simply asked people to stop using our private property, and the response was escalation. The fine. Then came the letter that changed everything. It arrived in a crisp white HOA envelope, and inside was a formal notice citing me for a violation. The stated reason: obstruction of shared driveway easement, placement of personal vehicle in community access zone. Attached was a fine. $75, with the promise that it would double if not paid within 30 days, and a note that repeated violations could result in a lien against the property. I sat at my kitchen table holding that letter, and something in me shifted from mildly annoyed to genuinely determined. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was an HOA board, or at least its self-appointed leader, attempting to fine me for parking in my own driveway, on my own property, based on a legal theory that existed nowhere in writing except in Deborah's imagination. I decided it was time to stop being polite and start being thorough. Building the case. I called the county recorder's office and requested a certified copy of the original subdivision plat and the easement agreement, the actual legal instrument recorded decades earlier when the land was first divided. It cost a small filing fee and took about a week to arrive, but when it did, It was exactly what I expected. The plat map showed the easement as a narrow, specifically bounded strip, labelled with the lot numbers of the two properties involved, mine and Walter's old house. Nothing else. No language about the HOA, no mention of community access, no indication whatsoever that this was meant to serve the broader neighbourhood. I also reached out to a real estate attorney for a consultation. I explained the situation, showed her the deed language, the plat map, and the fine notice. She confirmed what I already suspected. An HOA generally cannot create new easement rights over private property simply by asserting them in a handbook or a board decision. Easements are created through specific legal instruments, deeds, recorded agreements, sometimes court orders, not through majority vote at a homeowners meeting, and certainly not through one board member's personal interpretation of the way things have always been. She also pointed out something I hadn't considered. If the HOA was formally fining me based on a legal claim that had no basis in the recorded documents, that fine itself might not be enforceable, and continuing to issue it could expose the HOA to liability. Armed with all of this, I did two things. First, I wrote a formal, respectful letter to the full HOA board, not just Deborah, attaching copies of the deed, the plat map, and a short written summary from my attorney explaining the legal distinction between an appurtenant easement and a public or community easement. Second, I requested to be placed on the agenda for the next HOA meeting to address the matter directly, in front of the entire board and any residents who wanted to attend. The meeting was held in the clubhouse of our development, a slightly musty room with folding chairs and a table at the front where the board sat today. I'll be honest, I was nervous walking in. Public disputes aren't really my comfort zone. But Mark came with me, and so did a folder with 3 copies of every relevant document, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you bring backup copies to a fight like this. Deborah opened the meeting the way she always did, running through routine business with brisk efficiency. When my item came up on the agenda, she introduced it briefly, almost dismissively, describing it to the room as a resident disputing standard community driveway usage. I stood up, thanked the board for their time, and got straight to the point. I explained that the driveway in question was not a community resource but a private, appurtenant easement benefiting one specific neighbouring lot, as clearly documented in both my deed and the original recorded plat. I distributed copies of the plat map and deed language to each board member and to a few residents in the front row who seemed interested. Deborah interrupted almost immediately, insisting that this is how it's always been used, and that changing it now would be unfair to residents who relied on the extra parking during events. I responded as calmly as I could. I said I understood the driveway had been informally used for extra parking during some events in the past, likely without my predecessor objecting, but that informal, permissive use over a limited time doesn't create a legal right, especially when the actual property owner is now formally objecting to it. I mentioned, gently, that continuing to direct residents to park there, and issuing fines to me for objecting, could expose the HOA to legal risk, since the association had no recorded authority over that strip of land. There was a long pause. One of the other board members, a soft-spoken man named Raymond who mostly stayed quiet during meetings, leaned forward and asked to see the plat map again. He read it slowly, then looked at Deborah and said, "This is pretty clear. It names the 2 lots specifically. I don't see anything here about the HOA or general community access." Deborah tried to argue that the handbook language superseded the deed, but another board member gently pointed out that an HOA's internal rules can't override a legally recorded property right. You can't vote your way into owning someone else's land, no matter how many decades you've been doing it. The meeting ended with the board agreeing to have their own legal counsel review the documents I'd provided. I left that night not with a total victory, but with something almost as good. For the first time, people other than Mark and me were looking at the actual facts instead of just accepting Deborah's version of events. The slow unwind. It took about 3 weeks for the HOA's attorney to respond. When the response came, it confirmed everything my own attorney had already told me. The driveway was, in fact, a private appurtenant easement. The HOA had no legal authority over it. The fine that had been issued to me was rescinded, along with a formal apology letter, vague and carefully worded, the kind of letter written by people who know they made a mistake but don't want to say so directly, but an apology all the same. More importantly, the board sent a formal notice to all residents clarifying that the driveway between our 2 properties was private, for the exclusive use of the 2 specific homes it served, and was not to be used for general parking or community events going forward. I'd love to tell you Deborah had some dramatic moment of humility, but that's not really how these stories go in real life. She didn't apologize to me directly. She didn't really acknowledge she'd been wrong at all. What happened instead was quieter and, honestly, more satisfying in its own way. People started noticing. Once the board's letter went out, a few longtime residents started connecting dots out loud, at the mailbox, at the next meeting, in the group chat that everyone pretended not to be part of. It turned out Deborah had made similarly confident, similarly incorrect claims about a few other things over the years. A supposed rule about mailbox colors that wasn't actually in any governing document. A fence height restriction she'd been enforcing that had quietly expired years earlier after a bylaw update. None of it had ever been challenged before, because most people, like me at first, assumed she must know what she was talking about. She had 2 decades of confidence behind her, and confidence, it turns out, is a surprisingly effective substitute for accuracy, right up until someone finally checks. At the next board election, for the first time in years, someone actually ran against her for president. It wasn't me. I have exactly zero interest in ever attending another 3-hour meeting about mailbox colors, but it was Raymond, the quiet board member who'd been the first to actually read the plat map out loud that night. He won by a comfortable margin. What it's like now. Life on our little cul-de-sac has mostly gone back to boring, which is exactly how I like it. The new owners of Walter's old house turned out to be lovely, and once the confusion was cleared up, they were genuinely apologetic. They'd simply been told the driveway was open for use, and had no reason to question it. We've since had a real conversation about the easement, laughed about the whole ordeal a little, and settled into the same easy, quiet rhythm Walter and I once had. They use the driveway to reach their garage. We keep it clear. Nobody parks a minivan across my garage door during a yard sale anymore. Deborah still lives in the neighborhood. I see her occasionally, watering her flower beds or walking her dog past our house. Our interactions since have been polite but distant, the kind of nod and half-smile exchange common between neighbors who both silently agree not to bring something up again. I don't think she'll ever admit she was wrong, not out loud, not to me. But she also hasn't sent another letter, hasn't issued another fine, and hasn't directed a single car onto that driveway since the board's notice went out. Looking back, what strikes me most isn't really the dispute itself. HOA conflicts happen everywhere, and driveway disagreements are honestly one of the more mundane examples you'll find. What strikes me is how close the whole thing came to going differently. If I hadn't kept our closing documents, if I hadn't taken the time to request the original plat map from the county, if I had just accepted the fine and let the informal parking continue because arguing felt exhausting and unnecessary, it would have been so easy to let it slide. That's usually how these things work, isn't it? Not through some dramatic legal battle, but through quiet, cumulative erosion. A car here, a folding table there, a fine that seems small enough not to fight, a letter that sounds official enough to just believe. Deborah wasn't operating from malice, I don't think. She genuinely seemed to believe her own version of events. But belief, no matter how confidently stated, doesn't rewrite a recorded deed. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's a simple one. Know your paperwork. Keep your closing documents somewhere you can actually find them. Read your deed, not just at closing when you're signing 40 things in a row and barely absorbing any of it, but again later, when you have time to actually understand what it says. If something feels off about a claim someone is making about your property, whether it's a neighbor, an HOA, or anyone else, the county recorder's office almost always has the real answer sitting quietly in a filing cabinet, waiting for someone to actually ask for it. Because at the end of the day, an easement isn't defined by who shouts about it the loudest, or who's been on the board the longest, or who has the most laminated binders. It's defined by a few careful lines of legal language, written years ago by someone who had no idea their words would eventually settle a dispute in a musty clubhouse on a Tuesday night. And when Deborah insisted, again and again, that my driveway easement was public, the deed, quiet, boring, unshakable, said something else entirely. It said it was mine.